Since 1976, Ohio has executed 56 death row inmates, ranking 8th in the United States, but among them are names that shook the entire justice system. They did not just kill, they killed with cold calculation, sometimes without emotion, sometimes for pleasure, some killed out of hatred, others because of prejudice, and some just to see what it felt like. But eventually, they all walked into the same room, a room with no way out. In this video, we'll tell you what crimes they committed, what they chose for their last meal, and what, if anything, they said when facing death. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're interested in stories from death row, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching this video from. Now, let's begin with one of the most notorious. First, Alton Coleman. In 1984, the name Alton Coleman became a nightmare haunting the American Midwest. Born in Waukegan, Illinois, Coleman already had a history of sex crimes, but no one could have predicted that. Within just 53 days, he would become the target of one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. With his girlfriend Deborah Brown, a woman with a mild developmental disability, recently released from a mental hospital, Coleman began a cross-state killing spree, 6 states. At least 8 people dead, dozens more assaulted and raped. Among them were children, the elderly, both black and white victims. From Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, to Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio, the pair traveled constantly, stealing cars and breaking into homes. Their first victim was 9-year-old Vernita Wheat, lured and murdered in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Then came Tamika Turks, age 9, and her mother Donna Williams, 25, raped, murdered, or disappeared and later found dead. Palestine Booker, 28, was killed and dumped in an Indiana state park. Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter Rochelle were murdered in their home in Toledo, Ohio. 15-year-old Tony Story vanished and was later found dead in Cincinnati. Marlene Walters, 44, beaten to death with a tool while her husband was tied up and abused. The crimes followed the same chilling pattern approach with a smile or false kindness. Then strike without warning, vanishing into the night. Each case was a private hell, and the survivors like Trina Gaither and Olin Carmichael carry scars not just on their bodies, but in their minds for life. On July 20th, 1984, Coleman and Brown were captured in Evanston, Illinois. After being recognized from a TV news report, Coleman received death sentences in 3 states: Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. But it was Ohio that carried it out first. On April 26, 2002, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Alton Coleman entered the execution chamber. He showed no emotion, offered no message to the victims' families. His final meal was a feast well-done filet mignon, fried chicken breast, French fries, sweet potato pie with whipped cream, French dressing salad, broccoli with cheese, collard greens, onion rings, biscuits, and a can of cherry Coke. Not a single apology, not a single tear. He simply bowed his head and slowly recited Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." The prayer echoed through the cold, white room, but for the 8 lives lost and those still grieving, it was never enough to be called justice. Second, Kenneth Bros. When it comes to executions in Ohio, the name Kenneth Bros cannot be left out, not only for the crime he committed, but for how his death marked a turning point in American legal history. It began in February of 1991. In Brookfield, a town in northeastern Ohio, Tammy Engstrom, a kind, hard-working 22-year-old mother, simply needed a ride home after meeting friends. Kenneth Bros, a familiar face in town, offered to take her, but instead of driving her home, he led her down a deserted road, and there ended her life. He didn't stop there. What he did next was so cruel that even seasoned forensic investigators fell silent. Tammy's remains were hidden and spread across 2 states, Some parts left in a sewer, others buried around Byros's yard in Pennsylvania. When arrested, Byros claimed he had lost control and blamed alcohol, but the jury didn't see a man out of control. They saw someone cold and calculated. He was sentenced to death, but Kenneth Bros' story didn't end there. Nearly 19 years later, the state of Ohio finally carried out his execution. He became the first person in the United States to be executed with a single drug lethal injection, replacing the traditional 3-drug method, which had been criticized as causing prolonged pain, on December 8, 2009, at the Lucasville facility. Kenneth Bros entered the death chamber. His final meal was elaborate cheese pizza with mushrooms, onions, and green peppers, crispy onion rings, deep-fried mushrooms, Doritos, French onion dip, blueberry ice cream, a can of Dr. Pepper, and cherry pie. And when facing the final injection, he spoke calm, steady, "I'm sorry, truly sorry. I want to thank my family and friends for their prayers, support, and belief in me. Father, I now receive your pardon to enter heaven. I'll now spend my holiday with God and my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Peace be with everyone. Amen." Those final words to Tammy's family may have offered a sense of closure, but the painful truth remains. Tammy died because she trusted the wrong person. Third, Dennis Maguire. In February of 1989, in Preble County, Ohio, a young woman named Joy Stewart, 22 years old and in the early stages of pregnancy, left home to look for a job. She never came back. Days later, her body was discovered in a wooded area, and the horror of what had happened shook the entire community. The man convicted Dennis Maguire, a previously convicted felon who had tried to appear friendly with the victim. The investigation revealed that Maguire had approached Joy with a polite demeanor, but what followed was a series of actions that led to an irreversible end. He was sentenced to death based on DNA evidence and multiple witness testimonies. But what made Dennis Maguire's case stand out wasn't just the crime, it was the way he was executed. In 2014, due to a shortage of lethal injection drugs, the state of Ohio changed its method using a combination of midazolam and hydromorphone that had never been tested before. Maguire became the first person in history to be executed with this drug cocktail. On January 16, 2014, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, Maguire entered the death chamber. His final meal included roast beef, fried chicken, a bagel with cream cheese, fries with onions, potato salad, butter pecan ice cream, and a can of Coca-Cola. About 12 seconds after the drugs were administered, he cried out, "I feel my whole body burning." Instead of lasting just a few minutes as expected, the execution dragged on for 25 minutes. Witnesses described unusual reactions, discomfort, and labored breathing, reigniting the debate over the humanity of capital punishment. For Joy Stewart's family, they said, "We have no regrets. He got what he deserved for what he did." But for legal observers, the case of Dennis Maguire opened a new chapter, not just in the pursuit of justice, but in the moral boundaries of modern punishment. Fourth, Robert Van Hook. On February 18, 1985, in Cincinnati, Ohio, what began as a casual meeting at a gay bar ended in tragedy. Robert Van Hook, 25 years old, entered a gay bar that winter night not out of curiosity or friendship, but with a much colder purpose. There, he met David Self, also 25. A kind, open-hearted man who believed in kindness and genuine connection. Van Hook appeared friendly. They talked, shared some laughs. For David, it was probably just a normal encounter, but Van Hook was watching, evaluating, and choosing. When the two left the bar together and headed to David's apartment, the city remained quiet. No one knew that only one of them would live to see the sunrise. In court, Prosecutors revealed that Van Hook had used the same tactic before, befriending men only to attack them. His motive was believed to be rooted in deep-seated hatred, possibly tied to sexual identity. This case, therefore, wasn't just a personal crime, it became a landmark in raising awareness and legal protection for the LGBTQ+ community. After the murder, Van Hook fled to Florida. There, he unexpectedly walked into a police station and said, "I did the same thing as in Ohio. I killed a man." The confession led Florida authorities to contact Ohio. Van Hook was extradited back to Cincinnati and brought to justice. After a short trial, he was sentenced to death. And then, time passed silently. 33 years, Van Hook remained on death row, surviving multiple execution delays, appeals, and debates over his mental health and childhood abuse. But in the end, the sentence stood. On July 18, 2018, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Robert Van Hook was taken to the execution chamber, the cold room, the white lights, and eyes watching from behind a one-way glass all witnessed the moment. His final meal wasn't extravagant, but it was complete: 2 double cheeseburgers, French fries, strawberry cheesecake with whipped cream, a vanilla milkshake, and a glass of grapefruit juice. When asked for final words, Van Hook turned toward the victim's family and said, "I'm very sorry for taking your brother's life." Then, in a calm, low voice, he began to recite an ancient Norse prayer. "Lo, I see my father. Lo, I see my mother, and my sisters, and my brothers." The prayer lasted nearly 2 minutes. Then, silence. The injection began to take effect. In an era where justice often feels cold and mechanical, this execution brought closure not only to a sentence but to a chapter filled with pain, repentance, and echoes of those who never had the chance to speak for themselves. 5th, James Filagi. Love, when twisted by control and anger, can become a weapon. The story of James Filagi is a painful reminder. A crime born from what was once a home. Lisa Huff. Filagi had once been James's wife. After a turbulent marriage, she decided to break free, reclaim her life, and protect her 2 young children. But James could not accept being rejected. On January 24, 1994, in the city of Lorain, Ohio, Lisa became the target of the very man she had once loved. After an argument, she ran to a neighbor's house to hide. She took cover in a closet, but James followed, broke in, and took her life. He was arrested shortly after. In court, no excuse could justify what he had done. James Filagi was sentenced to death for premeditated murder, a case of domestic violence that left deep scars in the community. For years, he filed appeals, only to later withdraw them. He said he wanted to accept his punishment and bring it to an end. On April 24, 2007, after 13 years on death row, James Filagi was led into the execution chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. The method was lethal injection. Before the lights dimmed, he was served his last meal: steak, baked potato, pierogies filled with potato and cheese, dinner rolls, fresh vegetables, strawberry cheesecake, and a glass of milk. Right before the drugs entered his veins, James looked toward his family. His eyes were tense but focused. He said, "I love everyone. The death penalty does not stop crime. It is simply legalized revenge. And sometimes, it takes the lives of innocent people." After those final words, he lay still, without resistance. The needle began its work, and everything ended within minutes. A sentence carried out, yet the debate over the effectiveness, ethics, and limits of capital punishment still echoes quietly behind the one-way glass. For Lisa's family, it was a long and painful road to justice, but that justice could never bring her back. James Filagi left behind a final warning. Love cannot survive when it's shackled by control, and when it explodes, the price is sometimes paid in blood. 6. Frank Spisac. In 1982, at Cleveland State University, Frank Spisac carried out a series of attacks targeting people he believed were weakening America. 3 victims died, including a minister and an African-American student. He called it a purge to begin a purer America. At trial, Spisac didn't hide his neo-Nazi ideology. He wore a Hitler-style mustache, quoted Mein Kampf, and declared he wanted to start a new race war. Prosecutors called him a preacher of hate. His defense argued mental illness, but that did not save him from a death sentence. Spisac appealed for more than 25 years. His case even reached the United States Supreme Court. But in the end, every door closed. On February 17, 2011, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, he entered the execution chamber without once looking back. The method was lethal injection, a familiar protocol in the state system. Before entering the chamber, Spisac was served his final meal: spaghetti with tomato sauce, fresh salad, chocolate cake, and a cup of hot coffee. He ate slowly, made no special requests, and showed no sign of emotion. Facing the witnesses behind the one-way glass, he didn't offer an apology. He didn't pray in the traditional sense. Instead, in a dry and steady voice, Spisac began reciting a Bible passage in German believed to come from an ancient Norse farewell ritual for fallen warriors. Seht da ist mein Vater, seht da ist meine Mutter, meine Schwestern und meine Brüder. Seht da ist mein Volk zurück bis zum Anfang. Behold, there is my father, there is my mother, my sisters, and my brothers. Behold, there is my people, going back to the beginning, a strange farewell, of faith lost to the very end. Spisac closed his eyes. The chemicals entered his bloodstream, and then it was over without a tear. No forgiveness, no remorse, only a cold void left behind by a man whose hateful beliefs once brought terror to a university campus. 7th, Brett Hartman. On September 9th, 1997, in Akron, Ohio, a seemingly ordinary morning began with a grim report. Police received a call about a homicide at a quiet downtown apartment. When they arrived, even the most seasoned investigators were left speechless by the scene. The victim was Wenda Snipes, 46 years old. The brutality was shocking not only for the outcome, but for its signs of frenzy and the extent of the trauma inflicted. The suspect was quickly identified as Brett Hartman, 23 at the time, a computer technician who had previously been romantically involved with the victim. Hartman admitted he had visited Snipes' apartment the night before, but denied killing her. He claimed that when he returned the next morning, he found her dead and panicked, calling 911. But the forensic evidence told a different story. Fingerprints, DNA, and personal belongings all pointed directly to him. In 1998, Brett Hartman was sentenced to death. He appealed for nearly 15 years, with support from human rights groups who argued that the violence of the crime had overshadowed the uncertainties in the evidence. But every appeal failed. On November 13, 2012, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Brett Hartman entered the execution chamber. No more lawyers, no more delays, no more appeals. His final meal included a hot steak with sautéed mushrooms, golden fried shrimp, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, macaroni and cheese, a glass of Pepsi, a can of Dr. Pepper, and a bowl of honeycomb cereal with milk. Dessert was vanilla ice cream topped with walnuts. Once everyone was in position, Brett was asked if he had any final words. He gave a small nod, smiled faintly, and said, "I'm good, let's roll." A simple sentence, but one that carried either surrender or a final display of defiance. The poison began to flow in silence until the very end. Brett Hartman never admitted guilt. For the victim's family, it was the day justice was served. But for some observers, his case remains a reminder in the search for absolute truth. The sentence may close, but the questions may not. 8. Rocky Barton. On January 16, 2003, a bleak winter morning in Waynesville, Ohio, the sun quietly lit up the backyard of a house where Kimberly Jo Barton was quietly packing her belongings. She had just made the decision to leave her marriage with Rocky Barton, a man she could no longer live with. She never knew this would be her final moment. Rocky was waiting. He had locked the gate, prepared a gun, and as she stepped outside, he pulled the trigger in front of his stepdaughter and another family member, a brutal killing in broad daylight, at the very home that once symbolized their life together. After the murder, Barton tried to end his own life by shooting himself in the face. He survived, but with permanent disfigurement, forced to wear a medical mask for the rest of his life. Once recovered, he made no excuses and did not resist justice. In court, he pleaded guilty and refused to appeal. He asked to be executed as soon as possible, saying it was the only way he could make amends for what he had done. And so, on the morning of July 12, 2006, more than 3 years after the murder, Rocky Barton was taken to the execution chamber at the Lucasville prison in Ohio. Under the bright lights and the eyes of loved ones and legal officials, he received his final punishment, a lethal injection, quietly entering his veins, closing the chapter of a man who chose death as a wordless confession. In his final hours, Barton was served the meal he had personally requested: pork ribs with barbecue sauce, French fries, biscuits, over-easy eggs, and a can of Pepsi. He finished everything except the cherry pie, which he said he wanted to save for breakfast, a detail both calm and painfully ironic. Before the drugs were administered, Barton looked toward his wife's daughter and his own 2 daughters, all present in the witness room. He said, "I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry for killing your mother. I don't ask for your forgiveness. There's not a day that goes by that I don't try to forgive myself. But don't let your hatred for me ruin your lives." He then turned to his parents and offered one final apology. And finally, quoting Gary Gilmore, the first man executed after the reinstatement of the death penalty in the United States, he said, "Let's do it." At 10:27 in the morning, the lethal injection was administered, ending the life of a murderer and one of the rare inmates in Ohio who voluntarily hastened his own journey to death. 9th, Adri Dennis. On the night of June 4th, 1994, in the city of Akron, Ohio, a group of armed teenagers roamed the streets, looking for someone to rob. In the heat of summer, a split-second decision ended one life and sent an 18-year-old straight down a path with no return. Adri Dennis, not yet 20, and his friend Leroy Anderson planned a robbery to make fast money. No ideology, no personal vendetta, just a string of reckless acts fueled by violence. Around 11 p.m., they ambushed 29-year-old Kurt Kyle, who was walking home with his girlfriend. When Kurt said he had no cash, Dennis pulled the trigger. One shot, swift, brutal, irreversible. Kurt collapsed in front of his girlfriend. Dennis and Anderson fled the scene, as if it were just another part of a teenage thrill. But the law saw it differently. Dennis was arrested shortly after. Throughout the trial, he never denied what he had done, but offered no defense that could soften the blow. He was sentenced to death. What made the case stand out was Dennis's age. He was so young, and over the years on death row, he changed. The teenage face from his mugshot slowly aged into that of a quiet man who knew his time was running out. On the morning of October 13th, 2004, at the Lucasville prison in Ohio, Dennis was brought into the execution chamber, a place where no tears could undo past mistakes. The method, lethal injection. His final meal included fried catfish, garlic bread, and 3 slices of pie pumpkin, pecan, and sweet potato. He ate so much that he asked for Pepto-Bismol to ease his stomach. Before the poison was injected, he turned to the victim's family and said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I did wrong, and I accept this death." His final words did not bring back Kurt Kyle, but in that last moment, Adri Dennis did not run from his guilt. A sentence closed, a youth faded, and one life forever gone. 10. Scott Andrew Mink, September 19th, 2000. A quiet morning in Dayton, Ohio, calm outside, but chaos inside a small suburban home. There, a 36-year-old man committed a crime so devastating, even he could never forgive himself. His name was Scott Andrew Mink. Mink lived with his elderly parents, William and Sheila Mink. They had tried everything, even hiding the car keys, hoping to keep their addicted son from going out to buy drugs and alcohol. But that small act became the final trigger. In a rage, Scott attacked and killed both of his parents. It was an act of total collapse, driven by years of addiction and mental breakdown. The crime scene was horrific, so much so that investigators said it was one of the most disturbing cases they had ever encountered. Afterward, he took their credit cards, sold household items, and used the money to buy drugs. He didn't run for long. Soon after, he walked into a police station and confessed in court. He didn't blame anyone or make excuses. He asked to be sentenced to death, and after the sentence was given, he waived all appeals. Scott Mink was one of the rare inmates in Ohio who voluntarily chose to die. On July 20th, 2004, at the Lucasville facility. When time had run out, Mink was led into the death chamber, the method lethal injection. His last meal, eaten the night before, was a full spread of T-bone steak, baked potato with sour cream and butter, steamed cauliflower and broccoli, a cheeseburger with onions, lettuce, tomato, and mustard, extra salty fries, and a can of Pepsi. He finished everything except the broccoli. On the morning of the execution, he smoked a cigarette, drank some coffee, but ate nothing more. When asked for final words, Scott Mink simply said, "I just want to thank you for letting me make a final statement. I've made peace with my family and with God." And then, at 10:26 a.m., the overhead light poured down into the white room. No resistance, no tears, just silence and the weight of what can never be undone. 11th, Richard Wade Kooi, 2nd. One night in the middle of September 1986, two University of Akron students, Wendy Ofredo and Dawn McCreary, had just left a pizza place and climbed into a car headed to their dorm. They did not know that above a nearby overpass, two young men were preparing what they called a game, throwing rocks onto the highway. One rock struck Wendy's car, forcing her to stop on the pitch-black roadside. No one realized that this moment would mark the end of their youth. 19-year-old Richard Wade Kooi, 2nd, along with an accomplice who was only 17, approached their car under the guise of helping. But instead of aid, they used violence to threaten the two women and force them back to Kooi's apartment. Over the next several hours, Wendy and Dawn were locked in a windowless room where the two took turns torturing them, physically and mentally. Threats, abuse, and cruelty continued in an atmosphere of despair and silence. When their eyes closed forever, no one would know what they had endured. In the end, Kooi transported their bodies to a nearby forest and disposed of them. The crime shook Ohio, not only because of its brutality, but also because of the killer's shocking indifference. Richard Kooi was quickly arrested and brought to trial. The trial ended with a death sentence. But his journey to death would take more than 2 decades. During the 22 years he awaited execution, he never showed remorse. He filed repeated legal motions, ranging from requests regarding his prison diet to claims that he was too fat for lethal injection. He argued that his veins were too difficult to access, which could cause pain if the drugs did not work properly. His overweight inmate story sparked heated debate in the American media as a cruel irony of a protracted legal system. On October 14, 2008, at the Lucasville Correctional Facility, Richard Wade Kooi, 2nd, entered the death chamber. His last meal was extravagant: a T-bone steak drenched in A1 sauce, French fries, crispy onion rings, 4 fried eggs, a bear claw pastry, a scoop of Rocky Road ice cream, and a Mountain Dew. It was not a meal of repentance, but a final feast of defiance. Facing the glass where Wendy and Dawn's family watched, Kooi left a defiant final statement. "They did not listen to a single thing I said for 22 years. Why would you listen to anything I say now?" There was no apology, no tears, no acceptance of responsibility. His death marked the end of his biological life, but not the end of the pain. Wendy and Dawn never graduated. They never experienced love. They never lived their 20s. Their families have carried that wound for nearly half a lifetime, while the killer never truly looked back. Richard Wade, Kooi, II, was not just a death row inmate. He is a chilling reminder that some crimes can never be cleansed, by time or by death. 12th, Ronald Ray Phillips. Sheila Marie did not deserve what I did to her. This was the first apology her family ever heard from him after more than 2 decades of waiting. In 1993, in Akron, Ohio, Ronald Ray Phillips was living with his girlfriend and her young daughter, Sheila Marie. The little girl was later found with severe injuries all over her body. On a fateful day in January, she was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. But within just a few hours, her small heart stopped beating forever. Doctors described the extent of her injuries as unacceptable for a 3-year-old child. The community was shocked and outraged. Sheila's biological mother, Faye Evans, was also sentenced for failing to protect her daughter, and she died in prison years later. Phillips was arrested shortly afterward and took full responsibility. The court sentenced him to death, the highest penalty. But the execution process dragged on for over 24 years. During that time, Phillips filed numerous appeals. He argued that he had been too young at the time of the crime and even offered to donate a kidney to his mother. None of these motions changed the outcome, but they did bring renewed public attention to the case and to the unhealed pain of Sheila's family. Finally, on July 26, 2017, Ronald Ray Phillips became the first person executed in Ohio after a 3-year pause in executions. It happened at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility using a 3-drug lethal injection protocol, considered the most humane method at the time. The process went smoothly, lasting less than 15 minutes. Present in the witness room were members of Sheila's family, who had carried their grief for nearly a quarter of a century. Phillips's final meal was a personal, symbolic choice: cheese pizza with mushrooms and bell peppers, strawberry cheesecake, a piece of unleavened bread used in religious rituals, grape juice, and Pepsi. It was a strange combination, as if trying to reclaim something that had been lost. Just before the needle was inserted into his arm, Ronald bowed his head in prayer, stayed silent for a few minutes, then spoke his final words. "To the Evans family, I'm sorry you had to live so long with my actions. Sheila Marie did not deserve what I did to her. I know she is with the Lord, and she suffers no more." That long-awaited apology brought Sheila's aunt to tears. Through sobs, she said, "After more than 24 years, my niece can finally rest in peace." Ronald Ray Phillips was no longer there to carry the weight of what he had done, but through every word spoken, every tear shed, this case remains a haunting reminder. Some pain can never be healed. It can only be heard and remembered. 13. Gary Wayne Ott. In February 1992, the city of Parma, a quiet suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, was shaken by 2 back-to-back killings within 24 hours. The perpetrator, Gary Wayne Ott, was only 20 years old. He had spent his teenage years battling alcohol and substance abuse, drifting without a home or clear future. He wandered through affluent neighborhoods, knocking on doors under the pretense of needing a phone, only to rob the unsuspecting. But this time, it was more than theft. On February 12th, Ott entered the apartment of 61-year-old Robert Wasikowski. After being led inside, he held the man at knife point, robbed him, and took his life. Less than 24 hours later, he repeated the same act with 45-year-old Sharon Kostura. Both victims lived alone. Both were attacked in the place they should have felt safest, their own homes. The community of Parma was in shock. 2 older residents had lost their lives over a few dollars and some household items. Otte was arrested not long after. In court, he confessed to everything. Later, forensic experts noted signs of personality disorder and pointed out his IQ was around 85. functional but suggesting some cognitive limitations. However, the jury did not accept these as mitigating factors. In 1993, Gary Wayne Otte was sentenced to death. Over the next 2 decades, Otte's legal team filed multiple appeals citing his age at the time of the crimes, mental health concerns, and efforts to reform while in prison, but every request was denied. The victims' families, especially Sharon Kostura's sister, stood firm. "I don't care how many Bible verses he's read in prison. We lost my sister forever," she said. On September 13, 2017, his execution took place at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Otte spent most of that morning writing letters to his parents, reading scripture, and praying. His last meal was an unusual mix of sacred and ordinary: a mushroom burger, a double cheeseburger, mozzarella sticks, Heath Bar ice cream, 2 donuts, banana cream pie, and a soda. It was less about indulgence and more about finding a moment of personal peace. Before the drugs were administered, Otte sang the hymn "The Greatest Thing," then turned to the witness window and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." A quote from Scripture, but for those listening, it was more than a prayer. It was a man in his final moments searching for one last glimmer of grace. No one knows if he truly felt remorse, but justice had been carried out, and in Parma, 2 families, one that lost a sister and one that lost a father, could finally close the chapter of mourning. 14th, John William Byrd Jr. In Lucasville, Ohio, on the night of April 17, 1983, 40-year-old Monty Tewksbury was closing up after a late shift at a small convenience store. He was a father of 2, known for his kindness and hard work, with no known enemies. But just minutes before locking the doors, a stranger walked in. And in the blink of an eye, Monty's life was taken. Police later confirmed that the victim had been stabbed multiple times. The attacker took a small amount of money and fled. The investigation did not take long. Surveillance footage and witness statements pointed to 24-year-old John William Byrd Jr., a man with prior theft convictions who lived nearby. Alongside Byrd was John Brewer, a friend and accomplice in the break-in. But what kept this case going for nearly 2 decades was not the original sentence, but Byrd's unwavering denial of guilt. For 19 years, Byrd insisted he was innocent, claiming that John Brewer had delivered the fatal blow. In fact, in 1989, Brewer wrote a letter to a lawyer confessing to the crime, only to recant a few years later. The conflicting testimonies, lack of physical evidence, and a long series of appeals turned the case into a lightning rod for debates about capital punishment and the risk of wrongful execution. Despite the controversy, courts upheld the original verdict. Byrd was the one who acted, the primary perpetrator. The victim's family, especially Monty's parents, Elaine and Joseph, spoke out many times, pleading for justice. At one hearing, Elaine's voice broke as she said, "My pain is waking up every day knowing my son is in the cold ground while his killer is still here." On February 19, 2002, after 19 years of resistance, legal battles, and final pleas, the death sentence was carried out at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Byrd refused a sedative. His last meal was simple: a grilled steak with A1 sauce, blue cheese salad, and all the grape soda he requested. A quiet choice, but perhaps the only part of his fate he could control after nearly 2 decades in silence. As the first needle was inserted, Byrd looked through the glass and said, "I love my family. Keep fighting against the death penalty. The corruption of the state will collapse. Governor Taft, you will not be re-elected." No apology, no admission of guilt. His final words were not of remorse, but a political statement. To those who believed in Byrd's innocence, it was a desperate cry. To Monty's family, it was the end of a tragedy that had lasted far too long. 15th, Alva Campbell. On April 2, 1997, at the Franklin County Courthouse in Ohio, 49-year-old Alva Earl Campbell Jr. arrived in a wheelchair. He pretended to be paralyzed, to gain sympathy from the police. And it worked. While being escorted through the courthouse hallway, Campbell suddenly stood up, grabbed an officer's gun, and fled. Hours later, he carjacked a vehicle in downtown Columbus. Inside the car was 18-year-old Charles Dials, a teen waiting for his mother to finish work. Campbell drove for nearly 3 hours with Charles held hostage. Then, he shot him and left him by the roadside. The crime shocked Ohio, not just for its boldness, but for its tragedy. Charles had nothing to do with Campbell. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Campbell was sentenced swiftly: death for aggravated murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. But the path to execution would take more than 20 years. During his time on death row, Campbell suffered from a long list of medical conditions: lung cancer, COPD, heart failure, asthma, digestive disorders, and weakened veins that made it hard to administer lethal injection. In November 2017, just before his scheduled execution at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, medical staff spent nearly 30 minutes trying to find a vein. They failed. The attempt was called off. Some witnesses described it as clinical torture. The victim's family, especially Charles's mother, had waited 2 decades for justice. In tears, she told the press, "He took my son in 3 hours. We've waited more than 20 years for the law to act." But Campbell would never face execution, not because he was pardoned, but because his body had become too fragile to die by order. On March 3, 2018, Alva Campbell died of heart failure at the prison's medical center in Columbus, Ohio. No injection, no execution chamber, no final statement. Just an aging inmate who died quietly on a hospital bed, nearly forgotten. Before his death, Campbell once told a prison chaplain, "I don't know if I deserve to live, but I know I've been dead for a long time." It was a quiet confession, but unclear whether it came from remorse or resignation. To those who support swift justice, his case was proof of a system that had failed. To opponents of capital punishment, it raised questions of mercy and physical limits. Alva Campbell did not die on schedule, but his slow death behind bars raised an even deeper question. Should justice be tied to physical pain or to a life that fades into obscurity? 16th, Romel Broom. On September 21, 1984, 14-year-old Trina Middleton had just left a football field in East Cleveland, Ohio, when she was abducted by 28-year-old Romel Broom. He committed a brutal crime against her, then stole her family's vehicle to flee. In 1985, Broom was convicted and sentenced to death. On September 15, 2009, Ohio prepared to carry out the execution. Broom was taken into the death chamber at Lucasville, but what happened next had never been seen before. The execution team spent more than 2 hours trying to find a vein, attempting it 18 times. Each attempt brought new pain. Broom cried, screamed, and begged. The procedure was halted, and Governor Ted Strickland issued a 1-week reprieve. Broom later filed a lawsuit claiming a second execution attempt would constitute double jeopardy, violating constitutional protections. In 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that because the lethal drugs had never entered his veins, the execution had not legally occurred, allowing the state to try again. A new execution date was set for June 2020, but due to a shortage of lethal drugs, Governor Mike DeWine postponed it to March 2022. Meanwhile, Broom lived in fear, waiting, but he would never face a second execution. On December 28, 2020, Romel Broom died of COVID-19 at a prison hospital in Columbus after spending 36 years on death row. Trina's family remained mostly silent over the years until after Broom's death. In a brief interview, her mother said through tears, "She was the light of our family. She never got one more day to live. He got 36 more years. So tell me, where's the justice?" Romel Broom was not only the only person in modern U.S. history to survive a failed lethal injection, he became a symbol of the ethical, legal, and moral debate surrounding capital punishment. When he died from a virus, not a fatal dose, the question remained: can a justice system truly face what it once set out to do? 17th, Austin Meyers. On January 28, 2014, in the quiet town of Waynesville, Ohio, 18-year-old Justin Back was preparing to join the U.S. Navy. In the kitchen of the home his parents had left to him, Justin laughed with two old friends, Austin Meyers and Timothy Mosley, both 19. It was a house where he had celebrated birthdays, shared dinners with his mom, and that day it became the scene of a betrayal. Austin, considered the mastermind, had devised a plan to kill Justin and steal a safe they believed held $20,000. In reality, the safe contained only papers and a handgun. But before they learned the truth, Justin was attacked and killed by Mosley, allegedly under Myers's direction. His body was hidden in a wooded area of Preble County under a pile of leaves and a fallen log, less than 100 steps from the road. In October 2014, Austin Meyers was sentenced to death, making him the youngest person on Ohio's death row at that time. Mosley, who had delivered the fatal blows, received life in prison. The verdict drew public debate. Why did the person who didn't strike the final blow receive the harsher sentence? The court argued that moral and legal responsibility as the mastermind carried equal weight. Austin filed multiple appeals citing his young age, group pressure, and a troubled family background, but both the Ohio Supreme Court and federal courts rejected them. He remains at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, awaiting execution. Justin's mother, Sandy, once said at a hearing, "He used to sleep in my house, he shared dinner with us. I never imagined that the boy my son called a friend would be the one to take his life." Austin Myers's story isn't just the tragedy of one family, it's the tragedy of a generation. A story of youth twisted by greed and cold resolve. And it asks, can justice truly be served when the victim lies in the ground while the killer still draws breath? 18th, Tyrone Noling. There's an innocent man on death row. I can't stay silent any longer. That plea from Tyrone echoed after more than 2 decades of waiting. In 1996, 23-year-old Tyrone Noling was sentenced to death for the murders of Bernhardt and Cora Hartig, an elderly couple found shot to death in their home in Atwater, Ohio, in April 1990. But the conviction was not based on physical evidence. There was no murder weapon recovered, and no fingerprints matched his. 3 young men initially claimed that Tyrone was at the scene, but later recanted, saying they were coerced into testifying by investigators. Meanwhile, DNA found on cigarette butts at the scene excluded Tyrone entirely and matched another individual who has never been charged. Still, the prosecution moved forward, relying on a theory of robbery as motive, one that was never proven. Noling has consistently appealed his conviction. In 2014, he was granted permission for new DNA testing. In 2022, the Ohio Court of Appeals ordered the prosecution to turn over key documents, but those records have yet to be fully released. As the legal system continues to stall, Noling remains on death row, awaiting a verdict he insists is deeply flawed. In 2023, a former juror, Christine Richards, came forward and publicly admitted regret. "I believe he might be innocent. If I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't have sentenced him to death." In a handwritten letter from prison, Tyrone wrote, "I am not asking for pity. I'm asking to see the light of justice just once before I die." Tyrone Noling's story is not just a legal case, it's a moral question still unanswered. If there is even a chance we got it wrong, do we have the courage to fix it? Or do we send a man to die, just to preserve the silence of the system? 19. Jeffrey Wogenstall. In November 1991, 10-year-old Amber Garrett was awake late at night in Harrison, Ohio. Someone knocked on the door. The man outside was Jeffrey Wogenstall, a familiar face, someone the family had once considered a friend of her mother. He used that trust to lure Amber into his car and disappeared with her into the night. 3 days later, Amber's body was found in a wooded area outside Bright, Indiana. She had suffered severe trauma that led to her death. Her clothing had been disturbed, suggesting a deliberate and disturbing act. In September 1993, Wogenstall was convicted of kidnapping, causing the death of a minor and harming her before taking her life. The trial took place in Hamilton County, and he was sentenced to death. despite ongoing debate about whether the crime occurred across state lines between Ohio and Indiana. The initial case relied on what prosecutors said was Amber's blood found in his car and on witness testimony placing Wenstall in a vehicle with a child. But that conviction has been challenged for years, amid claims of serious flaws in evidence collection and allegations that key information was withheld by the prosecution. Wenstall has repeatedly requested a new trial, arguing that crucial evidence from Indiana law enforcement and early forensic reports were not properly disclosed. Ohio courts have rejected these motions, but new documents continue to raise concerns about the fairness of the process. Amber's family, especially her father Robert Garrett, once shared, "Watching my daughter's case drag on for all these years, still shrouded in unanswered questions, it's torn us apart." They remain trapped in a cycle of grief as closure remains just out of reach. Jeffrey Wenstall is still on death row, but the story of Amber Garrett is more than a tragic crime. It is a cry of loss, a reminder that even the justice system can fail to bring full clarity. And it raises a difficult question. Even when the crime is horrifying, can we afford to get the ending wrong? 20th. David Martin. On the afternoon of September 27, 2012, in the Oak Circle SW neighborhood of Warren, Ohio, a gunshot echoed inside a quiet apartment. 21-year-old Jeremy Cole collapsed instantly, while his girlfriend, Melissa Putnam, suffered a severe head injury. The shooter was David Martin, a man both victims knew personally. According to investigators, Martin had held them in the apartment, interrogated them about a safe, then shot Jeremy in what was described as an execution-style killing. After his arrest, Martin confessed to everything. In September 2014, he was sentenced to death for 3 primary charges: aggravated murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. Prosecutors emphasized the cold-blooded, calculated nature of the crime. After the trial, Jeremy's sister, Amy Biles, said, "Nothing will bring Jeremy back." But today, at least, justice had a voice. It seemed like the case had reached its conclusion. But beginning in 2018, the execution process was halted because Martin had not been given access to legal counsel during his initial appeal, a fundamental legal right. That delay nearly caused him to lose all his avenues for appeal. In May 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court issued a stay of execution, citing that the case had slipped through a legal crack. As the case was re-examined, defense attorneys submitted new evidence suggesting that Martin may have an intellectual disability, raising deeper questions. Can someone be sentenced to death if they may not fully comprehend the consequences of their actions? Jeremy's family continues to wait, not just for justice, but for closure worthy of the son they lost, at the hands of someone they once considered a friend. But the case no longer hinges on simple lines of guilt or innocence, life or death. It has become a test of precision and ethics within Ohio's death penalty system. Is the death penalty a form of justice, or simply society's final act of surrender? We may not all agree on the sentence, but we all feel the impact of what they left behind. If you believe this series has value, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the death penalty is still the right answer? In this century, I'm the storyteller, and this is where we tell endings, so we never repeat beginnings.